Could you imagine receiving your salary in the morning, and by evening, it is already worth less? Holding money in your hands, knowing that in a few hours it may become nothing more than paper? In November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. Just 10 months earlier, in January, it had been around 17,000. In less than a year, the national currency of one of Europe's largest economies collapsed to a level almost impossible to comprehend. Workers were paid twice a day, sometimes three times. Wages were distributed in the morning, and people rushed to spend them immediately, not because they wanted to consume, but because they understood something simple and terrifying. If they waited, prices would rise again. Savings built over decades disappeared within weeks. Pensions became meaningless. Fear spread faster than new banknotes could be printed. This was not a natural disaster. It was not a foreign invasion. It was the result of economic pressure and political decisions. To understand how Germany reached this moment, we have to go back to the end of the First World War. In November 1918, Germany surrendered. The empire of Kaiser Wilhelm II collapsed. The monarchy was abolished. In 1919, a new state was established, the Weimar Republic. It was Germany's first national democratic experiment, but the republic was born into instability. In June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Under its terms, Germany was held responsible for the war and required to pay reparations to the victorious Allied powers. In 1921, the total amount was finalized, 132 billion gold marks. These were not paper payments. Reparations had to be made in gold or foreign currency. For a country emerging from a devastating war, this was an enormous burden. During the war, Germany had financed its military spending largely through borrowing rather than taxation. Public debt had expanded dramatically. The gold standard had already been suspended in 1914. The German mark was no longer backed by gold. After the war, Germany faced multiple pressures at once: massive public debt, reparation obligations, territorial and industrial losses, social unrest, fragile trust in the new democratic government. Inflation had begun during the war. In the early post-war years, it was noticeable but still manageable. But the pressure was building. Germany needed foreign currency to meet its obligations. That required gold reserves or strong export revenues. Yet economic recovery was slow. Political tensions remained high. Strikes and protests were common. By 1922, the German mark began to depreciate rapidly against the US dollar. This was not yet hyperinflation, but the system had become fragile. Under the weight of debt, external pressure, and internal instability, the government faced a decision that appeared temporary, a decision meant to buy time, to increase the supply of money. And from that moment, the path toward one of the most dramatic monetary collapses of the 20th century began. By the early 1920s, inflation already existed in Germany. During the war, the gold standard had been suspended. The mark was no longer backed by gold. The government had printed money to finance military spending. After the war, that practice did not disappear. Between 1919 and 1921, inflation accelerated gradually. The mark depreciated, but the situation did not yet appear catastrophic. The government faced difficult choices. It could raise taxes sharply. It could cut public spending. It could partially default on its obligations. Each option carried serious political risk. The new republic was unstable. The country experienced uprisings, attempted coups, and violent clashes between political factions. In that environment, harsh austerity could have triggered further chaos. Printing money seemed like a way to buy time. Issuing more marks made it easier to pay public sector wages, finance social programs, service domestic debt. The problem was that increasing the money supply did not create real wealth. It only increased the number of banknotes chasing a limited supply of goods. The situation deteriorated sharply in 1923. In January, Germany declared it could not fully meet its reparation deliveries on time. In response, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. This region was the center of coal and steel production. The Weimar government announced a policy of passive resistance. Workers were encouraged not to cooperate with the occupying authorities. In practice, this meant strikes. Factories stopped operating, Production declined, exports fell. Yet the government promised to continue paying workers' wages. State revenues were shrinking, state spending was rising, and the printing presses began running faster. The volume of banknotes expanded rapidly. Inflation, which had once seemed manageable, began to move beyond control. The exchange rate deteriorated faster than policymakers could respond. Confidence in the currency started to erode, and once confidence begins to disappear, a monetary system becomes fragile. Germany was entering a phase where inflation was no longer just about rising prices. It was becoming psychological. This was the moment when acceleration truly began. In 1923, inflation in Germany entered the phase that economists define as hyperinflation. The depreciation of the German mark became historically unprecedented. In January 1923, $1 cost approximately 17,000 marks. By July, the exchange rate had fallen to around 350,000 marks per dollar. In August, it reached roughly 4.6 million. In September, nearly 100 million. By October, the numbers moved into the billions. On November 15, 1923, the exchange rate peaked at approximately 4.2 trillion marks per US dollar. These figures are documented in historical exchange rate records compiled by the Deutsche Bundesbank and analyzed in economic studies, including the work of economist Philip Cagan. The increase in prices was not linear. It accelerated. By October 1923, monthly inflation rates were measured in the tens of thousands of percent. At the peak of the crisis, prices were doubling every few days. This made holding money irrational. Wages lost value almost immediately after being paid. In many cities, businesses began paying workers daily. In some cases, wages were distributed twice a day. The goal was simple: give employees a chance to spend their money before it depreciated further. Confidence in the currency deteriorated rapidly. Prices of essential goods increased dramatically. Archival data from Berlin shows that the price of bread, which had been measured in thousands of marks earlier in the year, reached billions and eventually trillions by November. The middle class was particularly affected. Savings accumulated over decades were wiped out. Those living on fixed incomes, pensioners, civil servants, and small deposit holders, suffered severe losses. Bank deposits became nearly worthless. Contracts lost practical meaning because the amounts specified in them depreciated faster than they could be executed. Businesses faced accounting chaos. It became nearly impossible to calculate costs, set stable prices, or plan production. Foreign currencies and tangible goods were increasingly viewed as more reliable stores of value than the mark. In some areas, barter began to replace monetary transactions. Hyperinflation altered social behavior. Spending became immediate. Saving lost purpose. Long-term financial planning became impossible. In August 1923, the government attempted administrative measures to slow the crisis. However, confidence in the mark had already been severely damaged. The faster prices rose, the faster people tried to spend money. And the faster they spent it, the faster prices continued to rise. This self-reinforcing spiral is a defining characteristic of hyperinflation, widely documented in economic literature. Money ceased to function effectively as a store of value. It also became unreliable as a unit of account. Although the mark remained legal tender, economically it had lost stability. By November 1923, the monetary system was no longer performing its fundamental functions. Hyperinflation reached its peak in the autumn of 1923. At that point, stabilization required a radical monetary reform. By the autumn of 1923, hyperinflation had reached its peak. Germany's economic system was approaching breakdown. Policymakers recognized that continuing to expand the money supply would only accelerate the collapse. In September 1923, the government ended the policy of passive resistance in the Ruhr. The state could no longer finance strikes through money creation. This marked the first step towards stabilization. The second step was a radical monetary reform. On November 15, 1923, a new currency was introduced, the Rentenmark. The conversion rate was set at 1 Rentenmark equals 1 trillion old paper marks. The issuance of the new currency was strictly limited. Unlike the old mark, the Rentenmark was not backed by gold. Instead, it was backed by mortgages on industrial and agricultural assets within Germany. More importantly, its supply was controlled. The printing of the old paper mark was halted. At the same time, fiscal adjustments were implemented. Government spending was reduced and budget discipline strengthened. Confidence began to return. The exchange rate stabilized. Inflation slowed dramatically. It is significant that stabilization occurred almost immediately after the introduction of the new currency. This illustrates an important economic principle. Hyperinflation is sustained not only by the quantity of money, but also by public expectations. Once people believed that the new currency would be limited and stable, behavior changed. Spending patterns adjusted. Confidence improved. Economic activity began to normalize. In 1924, the Dawes Plan was implemented. It restructured Germany's reparation payments and facilitated foreign loans, particularly from the United States. This provided additional support to the German financial system. However, stabilization did not mean restoration. The savings of millions had already been destroyed. Trust in the old currency had vanished. Hyperinflation ended, but its economic and social consequences remained. Hyperinflation ended in November 1923, but its consequences did not disappear with the old currency. Economic stabilization did not mean social recovery. Millions of people had lost their savings. The middle class was particularly affected. Small business owners, civil servants, pensioners, and those living on fixed incomes. For them, inflation was not an abstract economic event. It was a personal catastrophe. The state formally stabilized the financial system, but trust in the state had been damaged. Many Germans viewed hyperinflation as proof that the new democratic government was incapable of protecting their property and stability. The economic shock intensified political polarization. During the 1920s, both left-wing and right-wing extremist movements gained momentum in Germany. It is important to note that hyperinflation alone did not directly cause the rise of National Socialism. However, it altered public sentiment. It weakened confidence in institutions. It increased skepticism toward parliamentary democracy. It created a generation for whom economic stability became a matter of survival. Even years later, fear of inflation remained deeply embedded in German economic culture. Historians and economists argue that the trauma of 1923 influenced German financial policy for decades. Hyperinflation demonstrated how fragile a monetary system can be. Money does not function merely because it exists as paper or numbers. It functions because people trust its stability. When that trust disappears, the system can unravel faster than it can be repaired. The story of Weimar Germany is not simply about exchange rates and banknotes. It is a reminder that financial decisions carry consequences, and sometimes those consequences outlast the crisis itself.